Hello there, my name is DJ Chuang, and I'm recording this video to answer the question about multi-Asian churches that I just received as someone who you might be interested in learning about multi-Asian churches. And there's a couple things that I would say. First of all, that there are many multi-Asian churches. There's what's called the first generation multi-Asian church, and then the second and next generation multi-Asian church. It's a very broad category, and it's a very diverse category of Asian American churches. And the reason I describe them as multi-Asian churches is that these next generation Asian American churches, which I've shortened into the phrase multi-Asian, they're English speaking, largely Asian American, and have a multi-ethnic vision because they are English speaking. And here in the United States and Canada, English allows us to bridge the cultural differences, and there are differences, to reach both Asians and non-Asians. And so English facilitates that, and the next generation Asian Americans, there's a growing number of churches, as you can see in this chart, a growing number of churches over the years that are English speaking and reaching a broader audience beyond their specific ethnic Asian heritage. And at the same time, while there's over 300 English speaking, mostly Asian churches, there are also many ethnic Asian churches that have Asian language as their primary language, as well as their leadership. And some of those have English worship services. Now, numerically, there's about 9,000 of those ethnic Asian churches, of which a subset have English worship services as well. I don't have a breakdown of those numbers, but I would guess maybe half or a little bit more would have English services, and then all of those ethnic Asian churches would have the Asian language services, because apart from language, it is very difficult to share a worship experience. Now, I myself am Chinese American, and so for those of you that may be interested in learning about Korean American churches, both those who are Korean language speaking as well as English speaking worship services and churches, there's a wide variety of Korean churches as well, over 4,000 of them in the United States, many of them small in the sense of under 100 in weekend worship attendance, and then also a couple dozen that are very large, over 2,000 in size, many of them in Southern California, and then some that are scattered throughout the rest of the country, including San Francisco, Seattle, Dallas, Houston, Chicago, New York, and Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia would have some very large Korean American churches, over 2,000. Now, with language comes culture. So missiologists will tell us that language and culture are intricately weaved together. So when you participate in a Korean church worship service and community, you'll pick up a lot of those cultural distinctives. So in Korean culture, there's a heavy Confucian influence, which means there's honor for the elders, that there's a tendency to think hierarchically, as well as building consensus in a collective, communal sense of relating, and very family-oriented, and very also very desirous of doing things together. So in Korean spirituality, they're known for early morning worship service, as well as Cheonsonggido, which is praying out loud at the same time. So prayer is very fervent. Passion is one of their hallmarks of being a Korean Christian. And theologically, Presbyterians uh, have a huge influence because Presbyterians were the first missionaries in Korea. And so Presbyterian denominations that are Korean, a couple of those exist. And so they value that theological framework as well as ecclesiology, plus it fits the hierarchy. And then there's some that are Baptist, some that are Methodist, and a fewer number that might be non-denominational. Now, other ethnicities of Asian American churches, whether it's Chinese, Vietnamese, South Asian, Indian, Japanese, Filipino, each of those have their own Christian history in their native motherland as well as here in America. I describe more of that in my book, MultiAsian.Church. So I would encourage you to dig into that if you would like to know more about the history as well as the current development of how these ethnic Asian churches have spawned off and multiplied into English-only churches, and how some of those have become more and more multi-ethnic as well. So there's a whole spectrum of diversity. Get to know the Asian American or multi-Asian church in your community. And here in the season that we're living in, we're able to connect with churches online, regardless of geography, so that you have the opportunity to experience some of the worship, as well as connecting with people through Zoom calls or message boards or chats to begin relating to them on an individual in a smaller group setting. And that's how you'll really get to understand and appreciate how the multi-Asian and next generation churches are developing. It really comes down to relationship and being family to one another as brothers and sisters. A lot of things we have in common with the Christian church at large, and then there are some distinctives. So I outline some of those in the book, but I'll just mention a few off the top of my head. So one, very family oriented. Secondly, high value for education. And there's an influence of shame-based cultures from their background, from generations. And so what that means is a lot of discretion in terms of how freely they express themselves, especially in areas of brokenness and weakness. And then in terms of their English worship experience, a lot of similarities, whether you go to a generic white church or a Asian American church, you could close your eyes and hear the same worship songs and hear very similar Bible teaching, because the Korean American or Asian American pastors were educated in the same seminaries as most of the Anglo-Americans, Caucasians, even Latinos and some Black Americans as well. And so the worship experience would be very similar, but as you relate to them on an individual or in a small group setting, you'll pick up some of those differences, the nuances of how they relate, how they communicate, and how they show loyalty. I think that's a distinctive. Inclusion, I think that's a distinctive. So one of the experiences that you may pick up right away is the discussion that happens when deciding where to go out for lunch after a worship service. So get to know people on an individual basis and experience that small group experience, that familial feel, and you'll be blessed to expand your life experiences in multi-ethnic America. Thanks for watching this video. Add a comment if I could help you some more. Bye-bye.